should have done that beforehand. It's lovely to see all the people who are here this evening. It's great to see so many faces back again after we had from yesterday. I'm glad to be able to be here among the saints. It's really neat to be able to see the growth of a congregation over time. It's great to see some people that I expected to see and also some people I did not expect to see. And so I'm glad to have been able to do that. Yesterday, most of us who were here also were able to hear those lessons. I know that we have a few people here who were not able to make it, but a lot of times even the people who weren't able to be here still heard of the lessons, and I'm very thankful for that. But they presented us a baseline for us to think about this concept of how we are to be presenting. That is not the right show. All right, well, we're going to go back to this, and we're just going to do it without show. All right, so we're doing it without show. We did a baseline. We got ourselves ready to think about what it requires of us to think about evangelism appropriately, to make it so that we understand what our role is in taking the gospel to the world. We talked about some of the struggles that we sometimes maintain with that and how we don't always have the right mentality to be able to take that gospel, and some things that interfere with us having the right attitude, even the way that sometimes we pay attention to Scripture. But I think it is something that we did notice, and I think all of us would understand that, the disciples have an obligation, they have a responsibility, they have an opportunity to spread the good news of the gospel. And when you think about it being the good news, what does the good news mean to us? Think about how it has changed you from the inside out. The good news means that the godless life that I was living and the pain and the damage that I was inflicting on myself and others wasn't my destiny forever. That's good news. When you get to a place in your life and say, I don't have to live this way for the rest of my life, that is very, very good news. The good news was that guilt that I bore could be lifted off of me because I could be forgiven. The good news was that pitiful, pointless existence that I felt trapped in was not going to be all there was to my life. So you and I know that we have benefited from the good news, but not everyone else is always ready to hear that. And sometimes in our excitement to talk about that, we might get some pushback about our presentation of the gospel. And sometimes people will say, well, you guys don't know when to say when. You guys don't know how to shut up and kind of leave that alone. And I think that there is some truth to that. Now, I'm not saying that we should just stop talking about it, but I think it's okay to realize there are better and worse times to bring some of those things up. And that's not always easy for us because our excitement can sometimes override our good sense about that. So I want us to think about the fact that sometimes it's okay to think about the right time to be able to say things. There is a right time to be speaking about the good news. There's a right time for us to give that kind of explanation. We have to be wise about when we say it. But here's the thing. In between those times in which we are actually speaking to someone about what the good news is, as in making it clear to them, our example will do a whole lot of the talking that we're not doing at that time. What I'm saying is, we're never not proclaiming the gospel. Sometimes we are making it plain in our words, and other times we are making it plain in the things that we say. So, if we live the right way, the way that Jesus tells us that we should live, then it is going to come up, and that is what he intended. As in, we are supposed to live in a way that makes those opportunities come up. Now, we're going to go back to a passage that we looked at previously. I said it's going to be one of our key passages for this entire series, and that is in 1 Peter chapter 3. In 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 13, 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 13, we're going to begin there. He says, "Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed." And here he quotes from Isaiah 8, "And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled." The Isaiah passage there, he says, "Do not call it a conspiracy, what everybody else calls a conspiracy. You're not to be drugged around the nose by fear the way that everybody else is. You live differently. So even in the Isaiah passage, he's already talking about living differently because of your faith in Christ. He's making the application here in 1 Peter chapter 3. He says, but sanctify or set apart or make holy Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you. That's the part I think we know. Oh, we have to have that ready defense. And that's an important part of this. But that ready defense is going to be based on what? When they ask. He says, to give an account to everyone who asks for the hope that is in you. Yet, he says, with gentleness and reverence. And keep a good conscience in verse 16. So that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. He says in verse 17, for it is better, if God should will it so, that you suffer for doing what is right rather than for doing what is wrong. Disciples have an opportunity to be an example even through times of oppression and suffering for our faith. And when we maintain a good attitude, even in those times, we will have that opportunity to give the reason. So you see how that all kind of works. You are going to live in a way that is going to invite those kinds of questions, and when those questions come up, you will have a chance to be able to tell about the hope that is in you. So that is the purpose behind that. Now, I want to say that there's sometimes some struggles with that. First of all, our attitude is going to be our example. Our example gives us that chance to talk about the source of our faith. But without that right attitude, without that right example, we're not going to have those opportunities. This carries weight, even in this text, only when we are submissive to authorities above us and we demonstrate cooperative behavior. That has been Peter's point since chapter 2. He says this in chapter 3 after talking about all the different ways in which the saints are to demonstrate submission to all the different authority structures in their life. Now I want to remind you, he's not talking about an authority structure in our government like we have today. Okay? We have a lot of religious freedom. We're going to talk about that later on in this week. They did not. And yet, even on an oppressive government, he tells them to maintain submission in those times. And when you do that, moving to chapter 3, you'll have a chance to talk about your faith. A helpful attitude, he says, is slander-proof. What bad can be said about us if we maintain a helpful attitude even in the face of persecution and suffering? So we can hurt that helpful attitude with an attitude of rebellious willfulness. And I think sometimes that we have already ruined our opportunities by being willfully rebellious against authority structures. Peter, on the other hand, he also says that they are to maintain a good conscience. And we should. But sometimes, don't we use our conscience as an example to be more rebellious than cooperative? Even in church situations, sometimes you've seen this. You've seen somebody who gets kind of out of sorts. They want things to go their own way. And what's the ultimate defense? Well, that's what my conscience tells me. And sometimes we can bring that same attitude to government situations. Sometimes we can bring that same attitude to work situations. So how do we balance these two things? How do we have this clear conscience, but at the same time being able to respond when we have not had a kind of rebellious attitude? It's not an easy line to walk. It's not an easy line for us to walk. It would have not have been an easy line for them to walk. How do I know when I am being right in watching out for my conscience, and when am I being unhelpful? And how can I tell the difference between those two things? Thankfully, we are not left without good examples in that. And we have some good examples presented in Scripture. So we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel. For the rest of our study this evening, we're going to be in the book of Daniel. So go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 1. We're going to begin there in just a moment. In the book of Daniel, we can read about some young men who had to deal with this kind of question. What is the difference between keeping my conscience good, but also maintaining a helpful attitude? How do we maintain holiness and faithfulness while also be submissive to governments that don't always have our same values? So in Daniel chapter 1, like I said, we're going to spend the rest of our study here. I want us to note first that we have the example of some men who gave answers during a time of Babylonian integration. Now, I want to think about this for just a minute. Integration into culture is not an easy thing to do, especially when you feel like you are surrounded by a culture that is against your very values. Isn't that something that we often struggle with? How to rightly balance maintaining a good conscience when we are surrounded by a culture that's perhaps a very ungodly culture. And sometimes I think that our desire to demonstrate holiness can interfere with our desire to also be helpful. But I want to see exactly how that happened in this case. So starting in Daniel chapter 1, and we're going to read the first 7 verses. Daniel chapter 1, starting in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the vessels for the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, or eunuchs, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom there was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence and every brand of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discernment and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter into the king's personal service. Now, among them from the sons of Yehuda were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. To Daniel, he assigned the name Belteshazzar. Hananiah, Shadrach. Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abed-Nego. We're going to stop there for just a moment. The opening of this section, the opening of this book, provides us with several difficulties. An early difficulty that these young men would have faced would be the integration into culture. This involved the adoption of the literature and the language and the history of the Babylonians, and that would actually change the people of Israel forever. Think about it this way. The written language that had been used by these people is changed after this point. They go from what we would call Proto-Hebrew or early Hebrew to the Babylonian script. When you and I see Hebrew letters today, we do not see them as they wrote before Babylon. We see them adopting a script that was in use in Babylon. The language changes. They had used Hebrew before. After this, they speak Aramaic. When Jesus lived on this earth, he did not speak Hebrew, the same Hebrew that Moses did. He spoke Aramaic because of the change that happened to these people during the time in which they were in Babylon. Another difficulty, I think, that we can see here would be the integration into service. So first of all, you've got this idea that we're going to change these people's language forever. We're going to they're going to take away from them a lot of their identity, but then we're going to move them into our service as well. These young men were no longer going to be serving under a Judean king. In this case, we have Jehoiakim, who is taken into Babylon. They're not serving him anymore. Now they're going to be serving under Nebuchadnezzar. And I think sometimes we may think, oh, what a neat opportunity that they will get to serve under. No. Well, why would they want to serve the bloody pagan ruler who destroyed their city and everything they love? Why would they want to serve under this murderous oppressor who has come over and conquered them along with everybody else? Would they be in a hurry to serve somebody who is responsible for the ruination of their entire people? Everything they loved is gone, burnt up, crushed because of that guy. And they're going to be his personal servants? I don't know that they would be super excited about that prospect. As if these indignities were not enough, there was the alteration of names. If we look at their names that are written here, most of the Hebrew names either begin or end with either El or Yah. If you've ever thought about that, most Hebrew names, El, talking about God, and Yah, which is Yahweh, which is the name of the Hebrew God. So in this case, you have Daniel, and his name is changed to Belteshazzar. His name is being changed from El, God is my judge, to Bel, protect his life. Bel is a Babylonian god associated with Marduk. It's a vague equivalent to the god Baal. Just for a minute, I want to think about that. How much history has Israel had with Baal? A couple of run-ins, perhaps. But they're going to forcibly change his name. From Daniel, God is my judge, to Belteshazzar. He now has a name that features a Babylonian god. And of course, he's not the only one. Hananiah, that is, Yahweh shows grace. Change his name to the command of Aku. Aku was the Babylonian moon god. Mishael, who is like God? Like Michael, who is like God? No, who is like Yahweh? Mishael. Well, no, who is like God? Mishael. They changed his name. Mish-Aku. Who is like Aku? They just changed the God out of his name. It's a deliberate twist. Azariah. Yahweh helps. Turn to Abed-Nego, which is servant of either Nebo or Nergal, and it really doesn't matter. They're both Babylonian gods. What would it feel like to these young men to have such an intentional dig at everything that they knew about their own identity and religion? People don't like to have their names made fun of. Nobody likes that. It's not fun. I mean, kids do it on the recess playground because it's mean. They know it hurts people's feelings. That's why we do it. What if you're named after somebody that your parents loved? You're named after a grandpa. Named after a favorite uncle, perhaps. Your dad's best friend, a guy he served in the military. You become protective of that name, don't you? These people were not even named after a human that their parents loved. They were named after the God that their parents served. All of them had that taken away from them. What did they say in response? Nothing. You don't read anything about a response from these young men at all. They take that absolutely in stride. And I think sometimes we forget this because we refer to them by their slave names. I know I'm not trying to be funny, but that we oftentimes will use their Babylonian names because that's the way it is in the narrative, because chapters 2 through 7 are all in Aramaic. So when you talk about them and you say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you're not using their names. You're using the names that the Babylonians gave them, the Babylonian gods. What would it feel like to have to go through that? But yet they don't say anything. They don't rebel. They don't picket. They don't sit down on their hands and say, I'll serve you when you call me by my real name. They don't do any of that stuff. Americans are a patriotic bunch. I mean, there's some variation within that, sure. But what would it feel like? What would happen if we were conquered by a foreign power and all of our great politicians were taken in and forced to learn the literature and language of the oppressors? What if they took their children? And I want to make sure we talk about this. It says the young men, that word that's used there could cover anybody as young as 13 years old. Daniel and his friends might have been every bit as young as these guys sitting right here and put into service, changing their names, changing their language, changing their culture, and now you're going to serve the guy who just crushed everything you loved. Yet in that, you can see the helpful attitude demonstrated. We have a hard enough time getting our kids to learn our literature and language, much less somebody else's. There are times in which working within the system is really going to be the best example. The purpose of all these commands, of course, by the Babylonians was to remove a sense of religious or national identity. It would be helpful for preventing revolt and speed up the process of integration into this Babylonian culture. And sometimes I think we have this idea, if they take the things I have my faith in, then I won't have my faith anymore. How am I going to know who I still am if they take away the external things? Can I still have a relationship with God without those things? Can I still be holy and faithful and still show submission? Well, these men did. Saying nothing in this case meant trusting God in the face of a fear of losing identity. But what was the result? Did they lose their identity? In fact, the opposite. God was the one who established and maintained their identity. Everybody knew who they were. You look at verses 9 and verse 20 in this chapter, you can see in both of those cases, they were well known by the people who were over them. Their reputation remained immaculate, and that was a fact that was going to help them very soon. I want to pick up reading and talk about this other section. These men also gave great answers during a period of Babylonian providence. And so picking up in verse 8 in Daniel chapter 1, we'll read through verse 16. Daniel chapter 1, starting in verse 8, moving through 16. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now, God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, not the same person, okay? Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please, test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this manner, and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine which they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. Older translations will say things like pulse, which would cover like legumes and any kind of seed-bearing fruits. Here you have a clash that is a little more obvious. It's more than just a question of dietary preference. I want to remember that. This is a demonstration of wealth by Babylon. What's at the heart? Why would the king even care that they would get this food? Think about that for a minute. Why would that even come up at all? Well, here, you need to see how powerful and great we really are. This is a demonstration of generosity. It shows the quality and quantity of providence that were available to the Babylonians so they might impress these young men. The king is not eating top ramen. The king is not eating frozen dinners, and he is not even eating filet mignon. I want you to think for just a minute about who Nebuchadnezzar is. He is literally the most important human on the face of the planet. He is eating things that you and I probably cannot even imagine. I've eaten some great food. I've eaten some great food this week. People have taken care of me and taken me to some of their favorite places. And I'm not downing those. But Nebuchadnezzar was eating much better food than that. He was eating better food than I have ever had. Food that's good enough for the most powerful man on the face of the earth at that time. What does it take for Daniel to say, you know what, I'm good. I'll stick with vegetables and water. That's fine. That's amazing. This is a demonstration of care for the young men who are here being groomed for service in this case. The foods were a show of the quality, of the kindness and the culture of their captors. The overseer's concern for Daniel, I love this, is his appearance and also his own life. It would have been easy for Daniel to accept in this case. I want to think about that. Have you ever been in a situation where you absolutely knew that you wanted to do what the Lord wanted from you, and then someone else had the excuses, hey, you know what? Look, I don't make the rules. Okay? Do you want me to get in trouble? Is that what you want? You're trying to do the right thing. You're trying to do the holy thing. And then someone comes to you and they say, hey, you're going to get me in trouble. And I don't want to get fired. And maybe you have that struggle in yourself. Maybe you have to go, maybe I don't want that guy to get fired because I'm thinking about his family, I'm thinking about his situation, and we can be tempted to capitulate in those situations. But this guy, he's not afraid of getting fired. He is afraid of getting killed. Here he says to Daniel, you want me to give up my life? How easy would it be for Daniel to say, all right, I don't want any trouble for you either. Another way to look at this would be a demonstration of opportunity and prestige. These young men and nobles were obviously important, and they knew they were important because the Babylonians were telling them they were important. The king's food showed the quality, the capacity of these young men who are candidates for this position. I want to think about what they are being groomed for, what they're being prepared for, what they're being trained for. This is, I know the show's over, it's kind of like The Apprentice, the Babylonian edition, okay? They're supposed to move up through the ranks and serve this. This is going to be an amazingly prestigious position. You guys are so good. You guys are so the top. You're the top, the best of the best. And you're so good, the food that is good enough for Nebuchadnezzar. This is food that we think you're good enough to have too. It would be easy for them to say, ooh, it's almost too good to pass up. There was going to be a real sense of pride on the line. And even if the food itself was going to be an issue, I guess you could say that Daniel could have made demands that his diet be respected so that he could keep a sense of pride. You know, no one has ever taken diet regulations to have a sense of pride. Nobody does that ever, or to make other people capitulate to their diet regulations. But in this case, he could have done that. He could have really made it about himself. And he doesn't even do that. By responding with rebellion, Daniel and his friends could have lost that example, that helpful example that they had maintained. Sometimes, keeping a ready defense means saying please. Daniel tried this solution. He tried a different solution after what initially looked like defeat. He asked, he was told no. He says, look, you can't get me in trouble. I no. And rather than say, well, we gave it the old college try, he tries something different. And he asks someone else the same thing, please. We don't read that the steward that he asked took it up the ladder any further. He got the no from the one that Nebuchadnezzar had assigned, but the one who was one rank lower than him, he asked him, and he said, he didn't just say please. He said, let's test this. You can test me. And what does he say at the end of that? And whatever you see at the end of that, go with what you see. I want to think, now sometimes those of us in the church can have an idea that if we make a statement, that we are expecting God to come through on his end, that we are testing God, or that we are assuming too much about God. But notice what Daniel does. Daniel says, you test us 10 days, just give me 10 days, and at the end of the 10 days, whatever you see, we'll do. He is assuming that God is going to come through for him. Notice that. He makes the promise and banks on God coming through in that. So you might say it's a little bit assumptive. But Daniel did it out of faith because he knew God was going to come through for him. Working around the system provided a way for these young men to keep that good conscience without hurting their helpful attitude and example. Saying please meant trusting God through a fear of losing health or providence. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 1. I want to go ahead and finish up this first chapter with you. Starting in verse 17, we'll read through 21, the end of the chapter. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. It's important for our plot later on. Then at the end of the days that the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of all of them, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which all the king consulted, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Also important for the plot of the book. God protected and provided for their health. At the end of the trial period, they looked better than their counterparts. That may have even included their other Jewish counterparts who may have capitulated. They may not have refused the food. A simple please might help us to remain holy and still show faithfulness and submission. We don't like to say please because it makes us feel helpless. It puts us at the mercy of someone else. But I think that's because we think we're serving ourselves, or it's our ego on the line. Daniel and his friends, they weren't serving themselves, and it wasn't their ego on the line. They could say please because they were trying to do what God wanted, even with the situation with which they were faced. It's no secret, I think, I originally put this sermon together in a form in 2013. And even then, I could see that there were likely going to be some challenges in ethics between us and secular governments. And I said then that they were likely to increase over time. Well, here we are. It's 2024. A lot has changed, even since 2013. If you work in a government position, or if you work with anything that is connected to a large organization, you know at your job that sometimes there are conflicts of ethics between you and the people for whom you work. Sometimes we're tempted to dig our heels. Sometimes we're tempted to make a big show, make a big stink, and have other people, we demand that our faith be respected. But sometimes we'll skip right over the option of just saying please and trying to work within the system we find ourselves. But that's not the only answer that these men had to give, because godly men gave answers during a time of Babylonian superiority. We might think about it like that. Let's go look at chapter 3. This is an account that we know fairly well, and with good reason. I think there's a very good reason that we know this one well. In the first 3 verses of this, by this time Daniel has already dealt with Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He has been promoted to oversight in the region of Babylon. He's appointed his 3 friends under him, and they continue to also serve. After this, Nebuchadnezzar sets up a golden statue. He sets it up in a plain where it can be seen, the plain of Dura, where you could see it from just about anywhere. This statue is 75 feet tall and 9 feet wide. and the whole thing is covered in gold. Pick up reading with me, if you will, in verse 4. Daniel chapter 3, starting in verse 4. Nebuchadnezzar set up the statue. He calls all the people who are important people. The herald loudly proclaimed in verse 4, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations of every nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the," and I'm going to read some instruments here, and I'll read them one time. Hereafter they will be the instruments. That's Jeremy's alighting that one. It's a lot of instruments, but we're going to read the first time. "The horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music. You are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the instruments and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image which Nebuchadnezzar had set up." Verse 8 is where we get our conflict. "For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, 'O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the instruments, all kinds of music, is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over administration of all the administration of the province of Babylon, namely, using their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up.'" Verse 13, "The Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king." Nebuchadnezzar he instructs them about the charges before them. But then he also says, "I'm going to give you another chance." Okay? We're going to do this again. We're going to try again. You need to understand, I'm not so unreasonable, he might say. We're going to try this again. Starting in verse 15. "Now, if you are ready, at the moment that you hear the sound of the instruments and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image which I made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of the blazing fire. I want to pause real quick and talk about some of the things that we've seen. First, this showdown between Nebuchadnezzar and the Jews is about, first of all, it's a superiority of religion. I want to make sure that we're very clear about that. The Babylonians wanted to show that their religion was superior in terms of wealth and worth. And if you think about it, the statue itself is very impressive. 75 feet tall, 9 feet wide. That's pretty big, all plated with gold. Even if it was just a simple obelisk like the Washington Monument, that's still 2,500 square feet, all covered in gold, set up in a plain. Can you imagine that thing at sunset? Can you imagine that thing at sunrise? That big old tall thing right in the middle of a plain, that light hits it, I bet the whole valley lit up. It would have been an impressive thing to see by any measurement. You think about the sheer cost. I've seen different calculations of exactly how much gold. I mean, even if it's just plated with gold. We're not talking about solid gold. The solid gold estimations are exorbitant. It's like the national debt. But even if it's plated in gold, that is still a great deal of money. That's worth bowing to, right? There's nothing else on earth with that kind of demonstration of wealth. It has a lot to do with a superiority of authority. Specifically in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, this command, it goes out to all the peoples, nations, and languages. And look, that covers everybody. That's everybody. He's able to command everybody, is what he says. If you're an anybody, then he has the ability to command you. That same construction is found in Daniel chapter 7 in reference to who the Son of Man has authority over. Guess who the Son of Man has authority over? Everybody. But that's who he says, I can command to do anything I want. It was his authority to demand obedience. There's only two options, note, he says, bow or die. And I don't know if you've ever thought about what it would be like to be someone who is in the position of so much power that you could tell just with no due process, no question whatsoever. Either you do the thing I'm telling you to do right now, or they will literally kill you. I don't know if you've ever sat before a judge, or I'm outing myself. I don't know if you've ever been with somebody who had to sit before a judge. Judges have a lot of authority. It is a frightening thing. It is an awesome, and I mean in the original sense, an awesome thing to sit before a judge. If he says, get this person out of here and put them in a jail cell because they have mocked, because they have given me lip, or they didn't do the thing I said to do right now, they will pick you up and take you away, and you will be in a jail cell until that judge says, okay. Now, there's some appeals process, there's some regulations. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't have any of the regulations. And it's not like a jail cell. He says, do the thing I'm telling you to do right now, or they'll just kill you. And it's not like I have to answer for that. I don't have to answer to anybody for anything. And notice, he says, and what God is there who can rescue you from my hand? I am powerful enough that even the religion that you claim to hold on to, it cannot stand up to me. I mean, in his defense, it's never happened before. No God's ever stopped Nebuchadnezzar. He steamrolled across the entire land. That's the kind of authority that Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael are questioning to his face. It comes down to a question of superiority of control. And to a king, that's the same thing as power. I like that he comes across as magnanimous in his own mind. He says, maybe you misheard, misunderstood, maybe there's some questions in here. We're going to try this again. If you're ready, on 3, he says, I am the only person who can get you out of this mess. This time, having a ready defense meant knowing when to say no. This time, only working against the system was the only way to keep a clear conscience. And I want to note that they're not really being rebellious, if you think about it this way, because they are given 2 options. It's bow or die, and they said, well, just take option B. You gave us 2, and we're going to go with the 2. We're going to go with one of the things that you said. If you said it's bow or it's, get killed, we'll just take the killed. They were trusting God through a fear of losing their life. These young men believed in the power of God to save lives, and they were going to obey him even if he didn't. In loyalty, of course, God did protect and provide for their lives. Verses 21 through 27, it's the part of the story that we know best. The 3 young men are thrown into the furnace. The furnace is so hot, it kills the people who throw them into the furnace. The king sees, I love that he stays around to watch his own execution. He's already better than a Bond villain. So he watches the literal execution. He goes, hey, how many guys did we throw in there? They're like, 3 guys. He's like, there's 4 in there right now. And he says this last one, this 4th, looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar is made. He calls them out. And I think the part of their deliverance that catches my mind the most is the account. The Holy Spirit in the account tells us they didn't even smell like smoke. You guys like camping? Everybody likes camping, right? Being around a bonfire, it's fun, right? You ever wear a jacket to a bonfire? Right? When you get home and you got a jacket on, you've been to the bonfire, you just can't hang it back up in the closet? Why won't you do that? Smell like what? Smell like smoke. Smoke's hard to get out of clothes, isn't it? It's real hard to get out of clothes. They walked out of this fire. They didn't even smell like smoke. I love that the Holy Spirit included that detail. It tells us exactly how serious God's protection over them was. Picking up in verse 28 in chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielding up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no God who is able to deliver in this way." King caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. God protected these young men who were ready to give an account, a defense for the account of the hope that was in them. They did so with gentleness and reverence. Their attitude was their example. Their helpful attitude was really slander-proof. The only slander that someone could bring against them is that they were faithful, and they were not going to stop being that. They never responded with rebellion, yet they kept a clear conscience in everything. I want us to think about the different ways to respond to different situations. You and I, and we may not think of this, because I'm going to tell you right now, every time I heard Daniel, the account of Daniel when I was young, told, we always went with the refusal. That was the only thing I ever heard. The only thing it was ever focused on was almost a congratulations for their rebellious attitudes. Daniel refused to eat the food, and he almost had this idea with his hands on his hips, I'm not going to eat that food. The 3 young men refused to wear, and he almost had this idea of pride, but that's not the case at all. You and I can keep a clear conscience when we don't say anything. Because sometimes we have to work within the system, and we can trust God even when our identity is at stake. Because sometimes it's the stuff that we feel is an attack on us personally. That's the stuff we want to bank on. We make it about ego. We make it about someone not respecting me. We can keep a good conscience when we say please. That is, we can work around this system and trust God when our health or sometimes our prosperity is on the line. I know that there's a lot of people who bring up work situations that conflict with us trying to be here either on Sunday morning or sometimes for other events like Wednesday night. And you say, have you talked to anybody about that? No, I don't know. I brought it up. You didn't even bring it up at all? Nah. I mean, I got this job. I got to keep my job, right? I know I can't bring it up because I got to keep the job. It's not wrong to try to find a way to work. I mean, I know sometimes it's complex. I mean, you might have to do some different things. You might have to make some deals sometimes. That's what they did. They said, give me a chance on this. Let me prove it to you. And that other person might say, what, do you want me to lose my job? No, I don't want you to lose your job, but I want to work with you on this because it's important to me. But there are also some times when we have to keep a good conscience and say no. Sometimes we do have to work against the system and trust God when our lives or our livelihood is at stake. I am so thankful that people standing up for their faith does not end up nowadays with the threat of them being thrown in a furnace or later on to hungry animals. Some people won't even stand up for their faith if it will cause them minor inconvenience. It is important that we don't swing at everything that comes across the plate. Sometimes it's okay to not say anything because it's really not going to impact my conscience. It might impact my ego. Sometimes we can say please and do what we can to get along with that system, but there is sometimes where we still do have to say no. And it may not be our lives that is at stake today, but clashes with the values of the world, they are inevitable. But I want to think about one other defense that you and I are going to have to give. You need to know when to say yes. You need to say yes when Jesus calls you. If you trust him, he's going to provide your new spiritual identity. He's going to provide for you this new spiritual health. He's going to provide a new spiritual life. It says it is better to suffer for doing what is right than to suffer for doing what is wrong. The suffering for doing what is wrong is eternal. At some point or another, you have to realize you're going to have to respond and do what Jesus says. The greatest thing about this thing about authority is realizing who the ultimate authority is. And so many times we forget the ultimate authority is really God and the Son that he decided to have rule over us. Now, if you've never thought about these things, or maybe you've never made the decision to be under the authority of God, then there's an opportunity to do that today. Because you can. You can say out loud what you know to be true. You've heard, you know these things. I don't think there's anybody here who doesn't know what the gospel requires of us. It does require that we respond, though. Because you can say, I'm going to follow Jesus for the rest of my life. I'm going to make him my ultimate authority. In every situation that comes up, he's going to be the one who is boss. I don't care who I work for on earth. I work for Jesus. But it's going to require something more than me just changing allegiances. Because it's going to require life and death. Because at some point you have to realize you have to give up the life that you've put together, that ego that has to do with your accomplishments and all the things you've done so far, and you realize that most of that has been for yourself. You say, I can't follow God and also have all this ego. Jesus says you don't have to, because you can have that life crucified with him on the cross. You can be buried in the waters of baptism. Leave that old life behind. And the new life that you come out of that water with is a life that is dedicated to God. It is no longer you who live, but Christ in you. And that frees us to make the right response in every kind of situation. Now, if at one time you said you were going to do that, if at one time you said, I'm going to follow him with everything, for all time, but you know you have not been faithful to that, and you know you let other things stand in the way, there's an opportunity to communicate that. Ask the congregation here for their prayers. They will pray with you. They will pray for you. They will encourage you with their words and with their actions. If there's a spiritual need that you need to have addressed this evening, make it known now as we stand and as we sing.